The sun rose over the fertile lands of Egypt, bathing the banks of the Nile River in its golden light. The calm waters reflected the blue sky, giving no hint of the storm that was about to form. In the bustling streets of Ramesses, the capital of the empire, the Egyptian people went about their daily routines, unaware of the drastic changes that were coming. Meanwhile, in the outskirts of the city, the Israelites awoke to another day of hard labor and suffering under the yoke of slavery. Their cries had reached the ears of God, who was now preparing to act in a powerful and unmistakable way. Moses and Aaron, brothers chosen by God to lead his people, walked with determination through the corridors of the royal palace. Their hearts beat fast, but their minds were firm in the mission they had been entrusted with. They knew that the confrontation with Pharaoh would not be easy, but they fully trusted in God's power and promise. As they entered the throne room, they were met with the disdainful gaze of the Egyptian ruler, who saw them as mere disturbers of the established order. Little did he know that he was about to face the Almighty God. With a firm voice, Moses delivered the divine message. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival in my honor in the desert." In his arrogance, Pharaoh responded with scorn. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." His words sealed Egypt's fate, setting in motion a series of events that would forever be etched in history. God was ready to demonstrate his power in a way that no one could deny. The first plague was about to befall Egypt, and the setting could not have been more symbolic. The Nile, a source of life and prosperity for the Egyptians, would become the stage for the first display of divine power. Following God's instructions, Moses and Aaron went to the riverbank where Pharaoh used to go in the morning. Moses' heart raced as he prepared to perform the first great miracle before the eyes of the ruler and all the Egyptian people. With a decisive motion, Aaron stretched out his staff over the waters of the Nile, as God had commanded. The moment the staff touched the surface, something extraordinary happened. The once clear waters began to change color. A reddish hue started to spread, as if a powerful current of blood was flowing down the river. Astonishment gripped everyone present, including Pharaoh himself, who watched the scene with a mix of disbelief and horror. In a matter of moments, the entire Nile River turned into blood. The metallic smell filled the air, and fish began to die by the hundreds, floating on the now red surface. The sight was both terrifying and surreal. The Egyptians, who depended on the Nile for their survival, were thrown into panic. How could they drink, cook, or irrigate their crops with water turned into blood? The impact of the first plague was immediate and devastating. Pharaoh, however, remained stubborn. His magicians, using their tricks and enchantments, managed to replicate on a small scale what Moses and Aaron had done. This was enough to further harden the ruler's heart. He refused to acknowledge the power of the God of Israel and stood by his decision not to free the people. His stubbornness would cost dearly, not only to him but to all of Egypt. For 7 days, Egypt suffered from the lack of potable water. People dug along the riverbanks, desperate to find clean water. The suffering was visible everywhere, but Pharaoh remained unyielding. He could not imagine that this was just the beginning, that God had much more in his arsenal of plagues to demonstrate his power and mercy toward his chosen people. Meanwhile, in the Israelite camp in Goshen, the situation was completely different. By a divine miracle, their water sources remained untouched. They watched in awe as God protected them amid the chaos unfolding in Egypt. This distinction between God's people and the Egyptians would be a constant mark throughout all the plagues, a living testimony of divine care and protection. Moses and Aaron, strengthened by the manifestation of God's power, prepared for the next confrontation with Pharaoh. They knew the journey would be long and difficult, but they were determined to fulfill the mission entrusted to them. The liberation of the people of Israel was at stake, and they would not back down from the challenges ahead. As the days passed and the Nile River remained red as blood, fear and uncertainty grew among the Egyptians. Many began to question the wisdom of their ruler in challenging such a powerful God. Whispers of doubt and dissatisfaction began to spread through the streets of Ramesses and other cities along the Nile. In the palace, advisors and nobles pressed Pharaoh to reconsider his position. Some argued that it would be wiser to yield to the Israelites' demands before more calamities befell Egypt. Others, fearing the loss of their slave labor, insisted that Pharaoh should not give in. The ruler found himself in a dilemma, torn between his pride and the well-being of his people. Meanwhile, Moses and Aaron waited patiently for the moment to return to the palace. They knew that God was in control, and that each plague had a specific purpose. It was not just a display of power, but a way to expose the impotence of the Egyptian gods and demonstrate the supremacy of the God of Israel. As the seventh day of the first plague came to an end, there was a palpable tension in the air. The Egyptians, exhausted and thirsty, longed for relief. Pharaoh in his palace pondered his next move, and the Israelites in Goshen waited expectantly to see how God would continue to act on their behalf. That night, as Egypt slept a restless sleep, Moses withdrew to pray. He knew the battle was far from over and that the next plagues would be even more intense. With a heart full of gratitude for God's faithfulness and compassion for the suffering that was to come, he prayed for strength and wisdom to lead the people through the turbulent days ahead. The next morning, the waters of the Nile slowly began to return to normal. It was the end of the first plague, but only the beginning of the great demonstration of God's power. Moses and Aaron prepared to return to the palace, ready for another confrontation with Pharaoh. The second plague was about to be announced, and with it, a new wave of wonders and terrors would descend upon Egypt. The Egyptian people, relieved to see clean water again, could hardly imagine that their respite would be short-lived. God was about to escalate the conflict, bringing a plague that would invade every corner of their lives. The battle for Israel's liberation had only just begun, and the stage was set for more extraordinary displays of God's power and mercy. The sun rose over an Egypt that seemed to be restored. The waters of the Nile, once again crystal clear, reflected the blue sky. The Egyptians breathed a sigh of relief, believing that the worst was over. Little did they know that the first plague was only the beginning. Moses and Aaron, strengthened by the manifestation of God's power, prepared for another encounter with Pharaoh. The air was thick with anticipation as they entered the royal palace. Before the throne, Moses once again delivered the divine message. "This is what the Lord says, 'Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs.'" Pharaoh, still arrogant, scoffed at the threat. His refusal sealed Egypt's fate for the second plague. Without hesitation, Aaron stretched out his staff over the waters of Egypt, as God had commanded. Suddenly, a strange sound began to echo throughout the land. It was a croaking that grew louder with each passing second, coming from all directions. From the waters of the Nile, the canals, the marshes, and every water source, frogs emerged by the thousands. It was a surreal scene. Waves of amphibians leaping from the waters, covering the land in a green, slimy mass. Panic quickly spread among the Egyptians. The frogs invaded every space, every corner of Egypt. They entered houses, climbed into beds, and jumped into cooking pots. There was no place where the Egyptians could escape the amphibian invasion. The deafening sound of croaking and the nauseating smell of the frogs made life unbearable. Even the royal palace was not spared, with the creatures hopping through the lavish corridors and invading the royal chambers. For the first time, Pharaoh felt the full weight of the plague directly. Frogs in his bed, in his food, with every step he took. Arrogance began to give way to desperation. He hastily summoned Moses and Aaron, pleading, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." It was the first crack in the ruler's resistance. Moses, demonstrating God's mercy, asked Pharaoh when he wanted the frogs to be removed. Pharaoh replied, "Tomorrow." Moses agreed, making it clear that this would happen so that Pharaoh would know there is no one like the Lord, the God of Israel. The next morning, as promised, the frogs died. They were piled into heaps, and their stench filled the land. Seeing that relief had come, Pharaoh's heart hardened once again. He went back on his promise and refused to let the people go. His stubbornness would provoke God's wrath once more. Without warning, the third plague was unleashed upon Egypt. Aaron stretched out his staff and struck the dust of the ground. Instantly, all the dust of the soil turned into gnats, covering both people and animals. The gnats were tiny, but their impact was immense. They spread throughout Egypt, causing relentless itching and discomfort for everyone. Pharaoh's magicians tried to replicate this miracle with their enchantments, but failed. For the first time, they admitted to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he refused to listen to Moses and Aaron. The fourth plague came like a swarm. God sent clouds of flies that invaded Pharaoh's palace, the houses of his officials, and the entire land of Egypt. The constant buzzing and irritation caused by the flies turned life into torment for the Egyptians. But this time, God made a clear distinction. In Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there were no flies. It was a clear sign of divine protection over his people. Faced with this new calamity, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land." Moses explained that this would not be appropriate, as the sacrifices they would offer would be detestable to the Egyptians. He insisted that they must go on a 3-day journey to worship God as he had commanded. Pressured, Pharaoh agreed to let them go as long as they didn't go too far. Once again, Moses interceded with God and the flies left Egypt. Not a single fly remained. But, as in the previous times, as soon as relief came, Pharaoh went back on his word. His heart hardened again and he refused to let the people go. The battle between the God of Israel and Pharaoh's stubbornness continued, with increasingly severe consequences for the Egyptian people. Meanwhile, the Israelites in Goshen watched in amazement as God protected them. The plagues that ravaged Egypt did not touch them. This clear distinction between God's people and the Egyptians was a powerful testimony to divine care and faithfulness. With each new plague, the Israelites' faith grew stronger, and their hope for deliverance increased. Moses and Aaron, though weary from the constant confrontations with Pharaoh, remained steadfast in their mission. They knew that God was in control and that each plague had a specific purpose. It was not just a display of power, but a way to expose the impotence of the Egyptian gods and demonstrate the supremacy of the God of Israel. They prepared for the next confrontation, knowing that even more severe plagues were yet to come. The Egyptian people, on the other hand, began to question the wisdom of their ruler. Many already recognized the power of the God of Israel and feared what might happen if Pharaoh continued to defy this powerful God. Whispers of dissent began to spread, but fear of Pharaoh still kept most people silent. The stage was set for the next plagues, which would be even more devastating. That night, as Egypt tried to recover from the plague of insects, Moses withdrew to pray. He knew the battle was far from over, and that the next plagues would be even more intense. With a heavy heart for the suffering he saw around him, but strengthened by God's faithfulness, he prayed for wisdom and courage for the days ahead. The next morning, Moses and Aaron prepared for yet another confrontation with Pharaoh. The air was thick with tension. The Egyptians, exhausted and fearful, could hardly imagine that the worst was still to come. The upcoming plagues would strike not only their comfort, but also the very sustenance and health of the Egyptian people. The battle for Israel's liberation was about to enter a new and terrifying phase. The dawn brought a sense of apprehension throughout Egypt. The air was heavy, not only with the desert heat but with the fear of what might come next. Moses and Aaron, determined in their divine mission, once again made their way to Pharaoh's palace. This time, they carried an even more severe warning, a plague that would strike at the heart of Egypt's economy. Before the throne, Moses proclaimed God's message. "The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, 'Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field.'" Pharaoh, still reluctant to give in, ignored the warning. His stubbornness was about to cost his people dearly. The next morning, as God had announced, a mysterious and deadly disease began to spread among the Egyptians' animals. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep fell dead in the fields. It was a desolate sight. Entire herds wiped out in a matter of hours. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Egyptian farmers and shepherds watched helplessly as their precious animals perished. Animals used for transportation, for farming, and for food, all succumbed to the terrible plague. Lamentations spread throughout the land of Egypt as people saw their wealth and livelihoods disappear before their eyes. Yet, in the midst of all this devastation, a miracle stood out. In the fields of Goshen where the Israelites lived, not a single animal fell ill. Not one sheep or ox belonging to God's people was affected by the plague. It was yet another clear demonstration of divine care and protection over his chosen people. This distinction did not go unnoticed by the Egyptians, who began to recognize the power of the God of Israel. Pharaoh, intrigued by reports of this disparity, sent messengers to investigate the situation in Goshen. They returned, confirming that not a single animal belonging to the Israelites had died. Even in the face of this clear evidence of God's power, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He once again refused to let the people of Israel go. Seeing that Pharaoh continued to be unyielding, God instructed Moses and Aaron to perform a symbolic act that would bring about the sixth plague. They were to take a handful of ashes from a furnace and scatter them into the air in front of Pharaoh. This simple gesture would unleash a calamity that would directly afflict the Egyptian people in a way they could not ignore. Following God's instructions, Moses threw the ashes into the air before the eyes of Pharaoh and his court. As the ashes spread through the air, something extraordinary began to happen. Painful and festering sores started to appear on the skin of the Egyptians. Both men and animals were afflicted, covered in ulcers that caused intense pain and disfigurement. Affliction was widespread. From the humblest servants to the most powerful nobles, no one was immune. Pharaoh's magicians, who had once tried to replicate God's miracles, could barely stand before Moses, so severe were their wounds. The suffering of the Egyptian people reached a new level, with physical pain adding to the emotional anguish of the previous plagues. Once again, the Israelites in Goshen were spared. While their Egyptian neighbors suffered from painful sores, they remained healthy. This divine protection strengthened their faith and increased their hope for liberation. With each plague, they saw the powerful hand of God working in their favor. Pharaoh, even while suffering from the ulcers, remained unyielding. The Bible tells us that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. This hardening was not a divine imposition, but a permission for the ruler to follow the path his own pride dictated. Each refusal to obey God only deepened his obstinacy. While Egypt suffered, Moses and Aaron continued their mission tirelessly. They knew that each plague had a purpose in God's plan. It wasn't just about the liberation of the Israelites, but also about revealing the power of the true God to a nation that worshipped false gods. Each plague directly challenged an Egyptian deity, exposing their impotence. Pharaoh's advisors, desperate over the suffering they saw around them, began to pressure the ruler to give in to Moses' demands. Some argued that Egypt could not withstand much more punishment. Others feared that the next plague might be even worse. Fear and uncertainty spread throughout the court. As the sixth plague continued to afflict Egypt, a sense of despair began to grip the people. Many started to question not only the wisdom of their ruler but also the power of their own gods. How could their deities remain silent in the face of so much suffering? Faith in the Egyptian gods was being shaken to its core. Moses, observing the suffering around him, felt a mixture of sadness and determination. He did not wish to see the Egyptian people suffer, but he knew it was necessary for Pharaoh to finally acknowledge the power of the God of Israel. With a heavy heart, he prepared for the next confrontation, knowing that even more severe plagues were yet to come. At night, as Egypt groaned under the weight of the sores, Moses withdrew to pray. He sought strength and divine guidance for the difficult days ahead. He knew that the next plagues would be even more devastating, affecting not just bodies but also Egypt's vital resources. The battle for Israel's liberation was far from over. The next morning, Moses and Aaron prepared for another meeting with Pharaoh. The air was thick with tension and fear. The Egyptians, already exhausted and wounded, could hardly imagine that the worst was yet to come. The next plagues would strike the very sky and earth, demonstrating even more dramatically the power of the God of Israel. The sun had barely risen when Moses and Aaron once again made their way to Pharaoh's palace. The air was heavy, not just with the desert heat, but with the tension of what was to come. This time, they brought an even more severe warning, a threat that would make even the bravest of men tremble. Standing before the throne, Moses delivered the divine message. "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. For this time, I will send all my plagues against you, your officials and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth." Still defiant, Pharaoh ignored the warning, sealing the fate of his people for the seventh plague. The next morning, just as God had announced, the sky over Egypt darkened. Black, menacing clouds formed, covering the entire land. Suddenly, a deafening thunderclap tore through the air, followed by a blinding flash of lightning. The most violent storm Egypt had ever seen was about to strike. Hail the size of fists began to fall from the sky, accompanied by lightning that struck the ground with uncontrollable fury. The noise was deafening, a mixture of thunder, the impact of the hail, and the terrified screams of the Egyptians. Trees were uprooted, buildings collapsed, and anyone or any animal caught outside was in grave danger. The farmlands, already weakened by the previous plagues, were utterly devastated. The flax and barley, Egypt's main crops, were destroyed in a matter of minutes. The hail crushed the plants, while the lightning set fire to what remained. It was a spectacle of destruction that clearly demonstrated the overwhelming power of the God of Israel. Once again, in the midst of all this devastation, a miracle stood out. In Goshen, where the Israelites lived, not a single hailstone fell. The sky remained clear, and the fields were untouched. This divine protection not only preserved God's people, but also served as a powerful testimony to the Egyptians of the distinction the Lord made between his people and those who oppressed them. Terrified by the violence of the storm, Pharaoh hastily summoned Moses and Aaron. For the first time, he admitted his wrongdoing. "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." It seemed that the ruler's heart had finally been humbled. Moses, once again demonstrating God's mercy, promised to pray for the storm to cease. However, he made it clear that he knew Pharaoh and his officials still did not truly fear the Lord God. As promised, Moses raised his hands to the heavens, and the storm immediately stopped. The silence that followed was almost as awe-inspiring as the roar of the storm. However, as soon as the danger passed, Pharaoh's heart hardened once again. He reneged on his promise and refused to let the Israelites go. His stubbornness would provoke God's anger once more, bringing a plague that would consume the little that was left after the devastating hailstorm. God instructed Moses to go before Pharaoh once again. This time, the warning was about a plague of locusts that would devour everything the hail had spared. Pharaoh's officials, already fearful, begged the ruler, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the men go so that they may worship the Lord your God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Pressured by his advisors, Pharaoh agreed to negotiate with Moses. He asked who would go if he did not let the entire people leave. Moses answered that everyone would go, young and old, sons and daughters, sheep and cattle. Pharaoh, reluctant to lose all his slave labor, refused to let the women and children go, provoking God's wrath once again. The next morning, Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt. An east wind began to blow, bringing dark clouds on the horizon. As they approached, it became clear that they were not clouds but a colossal swarm of locusts. Within moments, the sky was completely darkened by the sheer number of insects. The locusts covered the entire surface of the land, turning it black. They consumed everything in their path, every leaf, every fruit, every piece of vegetation that had survived the hail. The sound of their jaws was like the noise of a great army on the march. Within hours, what remained of Egypt's vegetation was completely devoured. Seeing the devastation caused by the locusts, Pharaoh hastily summoned Moses and Aaron. He confessed his sin and begged them to remove this deadly plague. Moses interceded with God, and a strong west wind arose, carrying all the locusts to the Red Sea. Not a single insect remained in the land of Egypt. Once again, however, as soon as the danger passed, Pharaoh's heart hardened. He reneged on his promise and refused to let the Israelites go. His obstinacy would lead to the 9th plague, one that would plunge Egypt into darkness so dense it could be felt. The battle between the God of Israel and Pharaoh's stubbornness was about to enter its final and most terrifying phase. Egypt, already devastated by 8 terrible plagues, barely had time to recover before the 9th plague struck the land. Without warning, a dense, impenetrable darkness covered the entire country. It wasn't just the absence of light, but a darkness so thick it could be felt. For 3 days, no one could see anything, not even their own hand in front of their face. Fear gripped the Egyptians. Trapped in their homes, unable to move or carry out their daily tasks, they experienced paralyzing terror. The darkness was so oppressive that many feared they would never see daylight again. This plague directly attacked Ra, the Egyptian sun god, once again exposing the impotence of their deities before the God of Israel. While Egypt was engulfed in darkness, a miracle was happening in Goshen. In the areas where the Israelites lived, there was light. This clear distinction between God's people and the Egyptians was another powerful sign of divine care and protection. The Israelites could move freely and continue their normal activities while their oppressors were paralyzed by fear and darkness. After 3 days of total darkness, Pharaoh, desperate, called for Moses. He offered to let all the people go but wanted them to leave their flocks behind. Moses, steadfast in his mission, refused the compromise. Not a hoof will be left behind. We need the animals to worship the Lord our God. Infuriated by this response, Pharaoh expelled Moses from his presence, threatening to kill him if he dared to appear again. Moses, knowing the final confrontation was near, replied to Pharaoh, "You will never see my face again." With these words, he left the palace, preparing for the 10th and most terrible plague that God was about to send upon Egypt. The stage was set for the final act of this divine drama. God spoke to Moses, revealing the nature of the last plague. "I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. Indeed, he will drive you out completely." The final plague would be the most devastating of all, the death of all the firstborns in Egypt, from the Pharaoh's eldest son to the firstborn of the humblest slave. Moses gathered the leaders of Israel and gave them detailed instructions for the night of the final plague. Each family was to sacrifice a lamb and mark the doorposts and lintel of their house with the animal's blood. This would be the sign for the death angel to pass over the houses of the Israelites, sparing their firstborns. The tension was palpable as the people of Israel prepared for that fateful night. In every home, families gathered, carefully following Moses' instructions. The smell of roasted lamb filled the air, mingled with whispered prayers and anxious hopes for deliverance. It was the birth of Passover, a memorial that would be celebrated for generations. At midnight, a cry of anguish echoed throughout Egypt. In every Egyptian home, the firstborn had died, from the heir to the throne to the son of the servant grinding grain. There was not a single house without a dead. The wailing was universal, a grief that struck both rich and poor, powerful and humble alike. Pharaoh, finally broken by the loss of his own son, summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. His voice trembled with pain and defeat as he said, "Get out of my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks as you said you would. Go, and also bless me." The Egyptians, fearing that everyone would die, begged the Israelites to leave quickly. The people of Israel, as instructed by God, asked the Egyptians for silver and gold articles and clothing. The Lord made the Egyptians treat them favorably, giving them what they asked for. Thus the Israelites left Egypt laden with riches, a symbolic payment for years of slave labor. That night, about 600,000 men, in addition to women and children, departed from Ramesses to Succoth. It marked the beginning of the Exodus, the journey that would take the people of Israel from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to the Promised Land. They left after 430 years in Egypt, exactly on the day that completed the 430 years. Moses, leading the people, reminded them of the importance of that night. Remember this day, in which you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, for the Lord brought you out of here with a mighty hand. He established the Passover rituals so that future generations would always remember the miraculous deliverance that God had accomplished. As the sun rose on the horizon, illuminating the long line of Israelites leaving Egypt, a new chapter in the history of God's people began. The 10 plagues had undeniably demonstrated the power of the God of Israel, not only to the Egyptians, but to all the surrounding nations. The news of these extraordinary events would spread, paving the way for what was to come. I hope you enjoyed this content. I humbly ask that you subscribe and leave a like so you can follow our future videos. Thank you for being here. May God bless you abundantly.